I cancelled the order an hour ago. These sandwiches look cheap anyway. I watched the investment banker turned real estate developer kick scattered food toward the gutter. 40 years ago, I'd built the very tower where David Sterling now made his fortune foreclosing on families like mine. The young catering business owner knelt on the cold sidewalk, tears mixing with rain as 300 gourmet lunches lay ruined around her. Everyone walked past. Office workers rushing to meetings. Tourists avoiding the mess. Even security guards looked away. But I stopped. I pulled out an envelope from my jacket. $5,000. My entire life savings. The last money between me and losing the house I'd built with these same hands. How much? I asked Sterling. You just gave me your mortgage payment, didn't you, old man? Maybe, but somebody has to. I'm a master carpenter. I built half this city, including that leaking tower Sterling calls his headquarters. And this young woman who delivers food to every floor of that building? She was about to become my secret weapon. Neither of us knew her delivery routes would give us access to evidence Sterling thought was buried forever. Or that my 40-year-old construction blueprints would expose the foundation lies that built his empire. If you're hearing this story, tell me in the comments. Where in the world are you listening from? Before we begin today's story, please don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. Now let's get started. The morning sun filtered through the thin cotton curtains of Gino Rossi's kitchen, casting pale rectangles across the worn Formica table. He sat in the same chair he'd occupied for 43 years, his thick fingers working methodically through the weekly ritual. Monday's compartment of the plastic pill organizer. Blue lisinopril for the heart that had been acting up since Martha died. White ibuprofen for knees that remembered every roofing job from 1968 to 2010. The house held that particular silence of a place where conversations had stopped. Not the comfortable quiet of shared understanding, but the hollow echo of words that would never be spoken again. Martha's coffee mug still sat in the dish drainer, though he'd washed it himself last Tuesday. Gino reached for the stack of mail beside his coffee. Bills always came on Mondays. The electric company, the pharmacy, a bright yellow flyer promising him discounts on hearing aids he didn't need yet. His fingers paused on a thick envelope underneath. Heavy paper. Official-looking return address, Keystone Equity Lenders. The kind of envelope that arrived when trouble was already at your door. He held it for a moment, feeling its weight. The morning light caught the embossed logo. Gold lettering on cream paper. Expensive. The kind of materials people used when they wanted to impress you before they destroyed you. His thumb traced the sealed edge. Once he opened this, whatever was inside would become real. Would demand action. Would force him to make decisions he wasn't ready to make. The landline rang. The sound cut through the kitchen like a fire alarm. Gino looked at the caller ID display, unknown. He counted the rings. 1, 2, 3. On the fourth ring, he reached for the receiver, then pulled his hand back. The answering machine clicked on. Martha's voice, still cheerful after 2 years in the electronic afterlife. You've reached the Rossi residence. Please leave a message after the beep. Static, heavy breathing. Then a young woman's voice, too bright, too friendly. Mr. Rossi, this is Jennifer from Keystone Customer Relations. We've sent you several important notices regarding your account. Please call us back at 1-800-555-LEND. It's urgent that we speak with you today. Click. Dial tone. Gino stared at the machine. The red light blinked like a warning. Message number 7. He'd been counting. He slid the envelope into the junk drawer beside the kitchen sink. The drawer stuck halfway, crammed with similar envelopes. Final notices from the water company. Property tax statements with red stamps. A notice from Medicare about coverage changes he didn't understand. The drawer looked like a paper graveyard of problems he'd been putting off until tomorrow. But tomorrow kept arriving. The landline rang again. This time he didn't even look. He reached for the coffee pot instead, his hand moving with the deliberate calm of a man who had learned to ignore things that scared him. The ceramic cup rattled against the saucer as he poured. His fingers weren't as steady as they used to be. Arthritis, the doctor said. Normal wear for a man who'd spent 50 years holding hammers. The ringing stopped, then started again. Gino turned up the volume on the small television beside the microwave. A news anchor was discussing Social Security cost of living adjustments. Numbers and percentages that meant nothing to him. The reporter's voice was professional, detached. Seniors on fixed incomes may see minimal increases this year, while housing costs continue to rise nationwide. The phone rang a fourth time. He gripped the edge of the counter, his knuckles white against the chipped formica. The coffee cup sat untouched, steam rising in thin spirals that reminded him of winter mornings when Martha would stand beside him. Both of them looking out at the snow-covered backyard, planning what they'd fix come spring. Spring never came the way they'd planned. The ringing stopped. The house fell quiet again, except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic on Carson Street. Monday morning rush hour. People going to jobs, carrying lunchboxes, checking the time on phones that never seemed to stop buzzing. Gino envied them, the luxury of worrying about being late instead of worrying about having nowhere to go. He opened the junk drawer again. The Keystone envelope sat on top now, demanding attention. Below it, he could see the corner of another document. The property tax bill from Allegheny County. The one with the red, final notice, stamp across the front. He'd paid Martha's medical bills instead. Every penny of their savings. The cancer treatments that didn't work. The experimental therapy that cost $30,000 and bought them 3 extra months. 3 months of hope that felt like a lifetime when you were living them, but looked like nothing when they were over. The math was simple. Pay the hospital, or pay the county. Honor his wife's memory, or keep the roof over his head. He'd chosen love over shelter. Now the bills were coming due. The garage door rumbled open next door. Mrs. Chen leaving for her job at the grocery store. She was 74 and still working because her Social Security check covered rent but not food. They nodded to each other sometimes, two survivors of the same shipwreck, too proud to admit they were drowning. Gino walked to the kitchen window and looked out at his backyard. The oak tree Martha had planted the year they got married was finally tall enough to shade the whole patio. 43 years of growth. The fence he'd built when their son Joey was learning to walk still stood straight and true, though the paint had faded to gray. This house was supposed to be their legacy. The place where grandchildren would learn to use tools, where family dinners would happen every Sunday. Where Martha would grow old in her garden and he would fix whatever broke. Instead, it had become a monument to everything that went wrong. The phone rang again. This time, he walked over and unplugged it from the wall. The silence that followed felt different. Not peaceful, but final. Like the moment after you sign the papers that change your life forever, when you realize there's no going back. Gino picked up his coffee cup. The coffee had gone cold, but he drank it anyway. It tasted bitter, like disappointment and old age and the growing certainty that fighting was useless when the enemy had more money than you had breath. But as he swallowed the last sip, something else rose up in him. Something that remembered what it felt like to frame a house, to set a foundation that would last 100 years, to build something that mattered. He opened the junk drawer one more time. This time, he pulled out the Keystone envelope. His thumb slipped under the seal. The paper tore with a soft whisper, like a secret being told. Inside, official documents. Legal language in small print. But at the top, in bold letters that cut straight through the bureaucratic maze, notice of foreclosure proceedings. Gino sat back down at the kitchen table. The morning sun had moved, leaving the kitchen dimmer now, shadows growing longer across the floor. He read the notice twice. Then a third time, his lips moving slightly as he worked through the legal terms. Some words he understood. Others felt like they were written in a foreign language designed to confuse old men who'd spent their lives working with their hands instead of pushing papers. But the meaning was clear enough. 60 days. That's how long he had before they could take the house. 60 days to come up with $43,000 in back payments, fees, and penalties that had multiplied like cancer cells while he wasn't looking. 60 days to find a miracle. He folded the papers carefully and put them back in the envelope. Then he stood up, walked to the kitchen window, and looked out at the backyard again. The oak tree stood steady in the morning breeze, its roots deep enough to weather any storm. But roots, he realized, don't matter much when someone else owns the ground they're planted in. The morning was getting away from him. Time to get dressed. Time to pretend that everything was normal for another day. But as he walked toward the stairs, something caught his eye. A business card had fallen from the Keystone envelope. He picked it up. Sterling Redevelopment Group, Community Revitalization Specialists. Below that, a phone number and an address downtown. On the back, someone had written a note in blue ink: Blighted properties scheduled for demo, spring 2024. Gino stared at the card for a long moment. Then he slipped it into his shirt pocket, right over his heart, where he could feel its weight against his chest. Upstairs, the floorboards creaked under his feet as he moved through the hallway that connected his bedroom to Martha's sewing room to the bathroom they'd shared for 43 years. Every creak had a voice, a story, a memory of footsteps and laughter and the gentle rhythm of a life built together one day at a time. Now the house was talking to him in a different language. Not the comfortable conversation of home, but the urgent whisper of something that knew its time was running out. He stopped in front of Martha's dresser mirror. The man looking back at him had gray stubble and tired eyes and hands that shook when he thought no one was looking. But underneath the weariness, something else was stirring. Something that remembered what it felt like to fight for what mattered. Gino straightened his shoulders. Today might be the beginning of losing everything, but it wasn't the end. Not yet. He had 60 days to figure out how to save 43 years of life. And somewhere in the basement workshop where his tools still hung in neat rows on the pegboard, Martha had painted bright yellow. He could almost hear the whisper of a plan beginning to take shape. Tuesday morning arrived with the kind of gray sky that made everything look older than it was. Gino stood at his kitchen window, watching the neighbor's cat pick its way through the frost-covered grass. The coffee in his cup had gone cold again, but he didn't notice. His attention was fixed on the sheriff's cruiser that had just pulled into his driveway. Deputy Marshall climbed out slowly, the way men do when they're carrying bad news they don't want to deliver. Gino had known Tom Marshall since the boy was 12. Riding his bike through the neighborhood, stopping to watch whenever Gino was working on someone's porch or fixing a fence. Now Tom wore a uniform and carried papers that could change lives with the stroke of a pen. The knock came soft but firm. 3 raps that echoed through the empty house like gunshots. Gino didn't move from the window. He watched Tom look around the front porch, taking in the details. The railing Gino had reinforced last spring. The steps he'd rebuilt after the harsh winter of 2019. The storm door that still closed tight and true after 15 years. Tom knocked again, then pulled a manila envelope from his jacket. He looked toward the kitchen window, and their eyes met through the glass. Tom raised his hand in a half-wave, the gesture of a man who wished he was anywhere else. The sound of tape being pulled from a roll. The rustle of paper against wood. The solid thunk of the storm door closing. Gino waited until the cruiser disappeared down Carson Street before he opened his front door. The notice was taped at eye level, impossible to miss. White paper with black lettering and an official seal that made everything real in a way the envelope in his drawer never had. Notice of foreclosure sale, it read. To all persons interested in the within described real estate. He peeled the tape away carefully, trying not to tear the paper. As if keeping it intact would somehow keep his world from falling apart. Back in the kitchen, he spread the document on the table next to his cold coffee and yesterday's newspaper. The legal language was dense, full of words like, whereas, and, heretofore, that seemed designed to hide meaning rather than reveal it. But some things were clear enough. The property at 412 Maple Street would be sold at public auction on the courthouse steps in 63 days. The minimum bid would be $43,827. Plus costs, plus fees, plus interest that kept accumulating every day like a disease that fed on itself. Gino pulled out his reading glasses and went through the document line by line. Somewhere in the middle, he found the words that made his stomach drop. Reverse mortgage agreement signed October 15, 2021. He remembered that day. Martha in the hospital bed, tubes and wires everywhere, the doctors talking about experimental treatments not covered by Medicare. The loan officer had been young and kind, explaining how they could use the house as collateral to pay for her care. No monthly payments. The loan would be repaid when the house was sold or when they both passed away. What they hadn't explained was the fine print. The maintenance clauses, the property tax requirements, the way a missed payment or a building code violation could trigger immediate foreclosure, even if the borrower was still alive and living in the home. Gino found his copy of the reverse mortgage documents in the filing cabinet Martha had organized with her teacher's precision. Every paper in its place, every document labeled and dated. He pulled out the thick folder marked House Papers and began to read. Page 12, Section 4.3, Property Maintenance Requirements. Borrower agrees to maintain the property in good repair and in compliance with applicable property standards and neighborhood preservation ordinances. Page 18, Section 6.7, Default Conditions. Failure to maintain the property as determined by annual inspection may result in acceleration of the full loan amount. His hands began to shake as he read. Not from age this time, but from something that felt like rage mixed with disbelief. There, on page 23, was a document he didn't remember signing. A property maintenance inspection report, dated 6 months ago. The signature at the bottom looked like his, but the handwriting seemed off. Too neat, too careful. According to the report, the property showed significant structural deficiencies including water damage to basement foundation, compromised electrical systems, and evidence of pest infestation requiring immediate professional remediation. Gino sat back in his chair and laughed. Not because anything was funny, but because the alternative was screaming. He had rebuilt this house from the foundation up. Twice. Once after the flood of 1995, and again after the ice storm of 2009 took out the back wall. He knew every beam, every wire, every pipe in this place. He had crawled through the basement just last month, checking for winter damage. The foundation was solid. The electrical was up to code. The only pests were the occasional mouse that came in from the cold. And he'd been handling those with traps and steel wool since before the inspector who wrote this report was born. But someone had signed his name to a document declaring his life's work uninhabitable. The phone rang. This time, Gino answered. Mr. Rossi? This is Jennifer from Keystone Customer Relations. I'm so glad I finally reached you. Her voice was younger than he'd expected. Bright and cheerful, like someone selling magazine subscriptions or asking him to donate to charity. We've been trying to contact you about your account, she continued. I have some options that might help you avoid foreclosure. What kind of options? Well, if you can bring your account current by the end of this week, we can halt the foreclosure proceedings. That would be the full amount of $43,827. Gino looked at his checkbook on the kitchen counter. The balance was written in Martha's careful handwriting, $5,247.83. That was everything. His Social Security, the small pension from the Carpenters Union, and what was left of their savings after the medical bills. What if I can't pay the full amount? In that case, we have a cash for keys program. You sign over the deed voluntarily, and we provide relocation assistance. $5,000 to help with moving expenses. $5,000. Enough to rent a studio apartment for 6 months, maybe. After that, he'd be someone else's problem. Let me think about it, he said. Of course. But Mr. Rossi? Time is really important here. The longer you wait, the fewer options we'll have. The line went dead. Gino sat in his kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of a life being dismantled by people who had never set foot in his house. The foreclosure notice on the table. The reverse mortgage papers with the forged signature. The property inspection report that described a different house entirely. He thought about Martha and how she'd fought the cancer right up until the end. Never giving up, never accepting defeat, even when the doctors started talking about comfort care and final arrangements. You don't quit on something you love, she'd told him during one of their last conversations. You fight for it until you can't fight anymore. Gino folded the foreclosure notice and put it in his shirt pocket, next to the business card from Sterling Redevelopment Group. Then he walked to the basement and pulled out his tool belt from the pegboard where it had been hanging since the day he retired. The leather was still supple, the hammer still balanced perfectly in his hand. He had built this house with these tools. Now he was going to use them to save it. But first, he needed to understand exactly who he was fighting. He climbed back upstairs and opened Martha's laptop, the one she'd used for lesson planning before she got sick. The password was still Grandpa Gino 43, their old joke about the grandchildren they'd always planned to have. The Sterling Redevelopment Group website loaded slowly. Glossy photos of downtown Pittsburgh, all glass and steel and modern efficiency. A mission statement about revitalizing blighted neighborhoods and bringing economic opportunity to underserved communities. At the bottom of the page, a list of recent projects. The Millfield Commons apartment complex where the old church used to stand. The Riverside Shopping Center built on the site of the elementary school where Martha had taught for 30 years. The Prosperity Heights condominiums that replaced the row houses where 3 generations of steelworkers had raised their families. All of them beautiful, all of them expensive, all of them empty of the people who used to call those places home. Gino scrolled down to the staff directory. Sterling Redevelopment was owned by David Sterling, age 41, graduate of Carnegie Mellon Business School, former investment banker with Goldman Sachs. His photo showed a man in an expensive suit, smiling the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. Below Sterling's bio was a paragraph about the company's community partnership initiatives and their commitment to preserving neighborhood character while promoting responsible development. The words felt like sawdust in his mouth. Gino closed the laptop and walked back to the kitchen window. The frost was melting now, leaving dark patches on the grass where the sun had finally broken through the clouds. Mrs. Chen was in her backyard, hanging laundry on the line she'd strung between 2 maple trees. She was 74 years old and still working 40 hours a week because Social Security wasn't enough to live on. Her house was probably worth twice what she'd paid for it 30 years ago, but that didn't matter if she couldn't afford to stay in it. He wondered how many of his neighbors had gotten similar notices. How many were sitting in their kitchens right now, reading foreclosure papers and trying to figure out how their American dream had turned into someone else's business opportunity. The phone rang again. This time, Gino unplugged it before answering. He had work to do. The downtown redevelopment district hummed with the kind of energy that comes from money changing hands quickly. Gino parked his 20-year-old pickup between a BMW and a Tesla, feeling like an artifact from a different century. The Sterling Development building rose 30 stories above him, all glass and chrome and angles that caught the morning light like weapons. He'd driven here with no clear plan, just the vague idea that looking his enemy in the eye might help him understand what he was fighting. But as he walked toward the building's entrance, he heard voices raised an argument from the sidewalk around the corner. Gino turned toward the sound and found himself watching a scene that might have been scripted by someone who understood exactly how power worked in America. A young woman knelt on the concrete beside an overturned catering cart, frantically trying to salvage what looked like 300 gourmet sandwiches scattered across the sidewalk. Her hair was pulled back in a ponytail that had come loose during whatever disaster had befallen her lunch delivery. Her hands shook as she picked up ruined food and stacked it in boxes that would never be opened. Standing over her was a man Gino recognized from the website photos. David Sterling himself, dressed in a suit that probably cost more than most people made in a month. Checking his watch with the impatience of someone whose time was measured in billable hours. "I sent the cancellation email an hour ago," Sterling was saying. "Check your spam folder if you have to, but don't expect me to pay for food nobody ordered." The woman looked up at him, tears mixing with the frustration in her voice. "The email came through 20 minutes ago. I was already here. The sandwiches were already made. Not my problem. These look cheap anyway. My investors expect quality catering, not whatever this is supposed to be." Sterling kicked one of the fallen sandwiches toward the gutter, where it landed in a puddle that reflected the gray sky like a broken mirror. Gino felt something shift in his chest. The same feeling he'd had 40 years ago when he'd watched a foreman berate a young apprentice for a mistake that wasn't the kid's fault. The same anger that had gotten him in trouble more than once, but had also taught him the difference between right and wrong. He looked at the woman's face and saw something familiar. Not her features, but her expression. The particular kind of defeat that came from working hard and following the rules. And discovering that the rules only applied to people who couldn't afford to break them. "How much?" Gino asked. Both Sterling and the woman turned to look at him. Sterling's expression shifted from impatience to something that might have been amusement. "Excuse me? The lunch order. How much does she owe you?" Sterling smiled, but it was the kind of smile that belonged in a courtroom or a boardroom. Not on a sidewalk where someone's livelihood was scattered across the concrete. Are you lost, old man? This is a business district. I asked you a question. The woman stood up slowly, wiping her hands on her apron. Sir, you don't have to. How much? Gino repeated. Sterling looked him up and down, taking in the flannel shirt and work boots and the tool belt that Gino had strapped on before leaving the house. Then his expression changed to something that might have been recognition. Wait a minute, you're Rossi, aren't you? 412 Maple Street? The way he said it made Gino's address sound like an accusation. That's right. Well, this is perfect timing. I was going to call you later today. Sterling pulled out his phone and scrolled through what looked like a list of names and addresses. Your foreclosure sale is, what, 62 days? 61? 61. Right. Well, I wanted to make you an offer before things get messy. Cash for keys. $10,000 if you sign the deed over to me voluntarily. That's twice our usual rate. Call it a professional courtesy, one builder to another. Sterling's tone was friendly now, almost conversational. Like they were discussing the weather or the Pirates' chances this season. Gino looked down at the woman, who was still kneeling beside her ruined catering order. She looked young enough to be his granddaughter, if he'd had one. Young enough to still believe that hard work and honest effort were enough to get by in the world. You didn't answer my question, Gino said. How much for the lunch? Sterling laughed. $5,200. But like I said, the order was cancelled. She can take it up with her insurance company. Gino reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the envelope he'd brought to the bank that morning. His entire accessible savings, minus the $50 he'd kept for gas and groceries. Everything he had left in the world that wasn't nailed down or mortgaged to someone else. He threw the envelope at Sterling's chest. Pay her. Sterling caught the envelope and opened it, his fingers moving through the bills with the practiced efficiency of someone who handled large amounts of cash regularly. This is exactly $5,150, he said. 50 short. Keep the change. Sterling pocketed the money and looked at Gino with something that might have been respect, or might have been pity. You just gave me your mortgage payment, didn't you? Maybe. Why? Gino looked down at the woman, who was staring at him like he'd just performed some kind of miracle. Then he looked back at Sterling. Because somebody has to. Sterling nodded slowly. Interesting philosophy. Let's see how it works out for you. He turned and walked toward the building entrance, leaving Gino and the woman alone on the sidewalk. With 300 sandwiches and the growing certainty that he'd just made the biggest mistake of his life. The woman stood up and extended her hand. Naomi Torres. Gino Rossi. Mr. Rossi, I don't know why you just did that, but I'm going to find a way to pay you back. Gino looked at her face and saw determination where there had been defeat a moment before. It reminded him of Martha in the hospital, making plans for a future she knew she wouldn't see. You don't owe me anything, he said. But maybe you can help me understand something. What's that? How a man like Sterling gets to decide who belongs in a neighborhood and who doesn't. Naomi started loading the sandwiches back into her cart, working with the efficiency of someone who'd learned not to waste time on self-pity. You want the short version or the long version? I've got time. She looked at him for a moment, as if trying to decide whether he was serious. The long version is that guys like Sterling buy up debt from banks and mortgage companies. They target older homeowners who might have equity but not much cash flow. They use legal loopholes and technical violations to accelerate foreclosures, then flip the properties to developers or investors. And the short version? They're vultures. But vultures with law degrees and political connections. Gino helped her load the last of the salvageable sandwiches into the cart. His back ached from bending over, and his knees complained about the uneven concrete, but something about the physical work felt good. Familiar. Like using tools he'd forgotten he owned. What do you do when you can't fight them in court? Naomi secured the cart's wheels and looked up at the Sterling Development Building, 30 stories of glass and steel that reflected the clouds like a mirror. You find another way to fight. As they stood there on the sidewalk, surrounded by the evidence of Sterling's casual cruelty and Gino's impulsive generosity. Neither of them noticed the security camera mounted above the building's entrance, recording everything. Later, Sterling would review that footage and see something that made him smile. An old man and a young woman, looking up at his building like David sizing up Goliath. He'd seen that look before. It was the look of people who still believed that right and wrong mattered more than lawyers and leverage. In Sterling's experience, those people were always the most satisfying to defeat. But as he watched the recording for the third time, something else occurred to him. David had been smaller than Goliath too. And sometimes, just sometimes, the stones found their mark. Sterling made a note in his calendar to accelerate the Rossi foreclosure. Just to be safe. The power company had been efficient. No warning, no final notice, just the sudden absence of electricity that transformed Gino's house from a home into a museum of abandoned routines. The digital clocks had stopped at 3:47 p.m., the moment when 43 years of continuous habitation officially became temporary occupancy. Gino sat in his kitchen as darkness fell, a flashlight propped against the salt. And pepper shakers Martha had bought at a roadside stand during their honeymoon in West Virginia. The beam cast shifting shadows on the walls, making familiar objects look foreign and strange. The refrigerator stood silent, no longer humming its quiet song of preservation and possibility. He unwrapped one of the gourmet sandwiches from Naomi's catering order. Prosciutto and fig jam on artisan bread, the kind of food he'd never thought to buy. But that tasted like sawdust when you were eating it by flashlight in a house that no longer belonged to you. The sandwich represented $5,000. More than his monthly Social Security check. More than his pension payment. More than he'd ever spent on food in a single transaction in his entire life. $5,000 that might have kept the lights on for 6 months. Or paid a lawyer to review the foreclosure papers, or bought him time to figure out what the hell had gone wrong with his life. Instead, he'd thrown it at a stranger's problem because watching David Sterling kick food into the gutter had reminded him of every bully he'd ever known. And because sometimes a man had to choose between being smart and being decent. Martha would have understood. She'd have called him an idiot and made him a cup of coffee and told him that doing the right thing was never a mistake, even when it felt like one. But Martha wasn't here to make coffee or offer comfort or remind him that courage and stupidity sometimes looked exactly the same until you found out how the story ended. A car door slammed outside. Gino looked through the kitchen window and saw a black SUV parked in his driveway. 2 men got out, both wearing dark jackets and the kind of confidence that came from knowing they had the law on their side. One of them carried a clipboard. The other carried something that might have been a camera or might have been something worse. They walked up to his front door with the deliberate pace of men who were used to being unwelcome but not particularly concerned about it. The knock came hard and official. Gino didn't answer. "Mr. Rossi, this is a courtesy visit from Keystone Asset Recovery. We need to discuss the condition of the property and your plans for voluntary relocation." The voice belonged to someone young, probably no older than 30. Someone who'd learned to sound authoritative by practicing in front of a mirror. Or maybe in business school classes on conflict resolution and asset acquisition. "Mr. Rossi, we know you're in there. The sooner we can talk, the sooner we can work out an arrangement that benefits everyone." Gino moved away from the window and sat down at the kitchen table. The flashlight beam wobbled as his hand shook, not from fear but from something that felt like rage mixed with exhaustion. "Sir, if you don't respond, we'll have to assume the property has been abandoned and proceed accordingly." Through the window, Gino could see the beam of a powerful flashlight sweeping across his backyard. One of them was walking the perimeter, probably taking photos of anything that could be described as a code violation. Or maintenance issue in the report they'd file tomorrow. The loose board on the back fence that he'd been meaning to fix since August. The downspout that had pulled away from the gutter during the last windstorm. The pile of scrap lumber behind the garage that he'd saved for projects that would never get finished now. In daylight, these would have looked like the minor maintenance issues of a 72-year-old man living alone. In the harsh glare of a security flashlight, they would photograph like evidence of neglect and abandonment. The knocking stopped. Gino heard voices in his driveway, too quiet to make out words but loud enough to understand that decisions were being made about his future without his input. Engines started. Gravel crunched under tires. The black SUV disappeared down Maple Street, leaving behind only the lingering smell of diesel exhaust and the certainty that they would be back. Gino finished his expensive sandwich and opened a warm beer from the 6-pack. He'd bought that morning, back when he still thought electricity was something you could take for granted. The beer tasted flat and bitter, like disappointment aged in aluminum. He tried to remember the last time he'd felt this alone. Not when Martha died. That had been grief, but it was shared grief, witnessed by neighbors and friends and the pastor who'd known them both for 20 years. People had brought casseroles and offered to help with arrangements and reminded him that he wasn't the first person to lose someone he loved. This was different. This was the isolation of someone who'd discovered that the rules he'd lived by his entire life were actually suggestions. And that the people writing the new rules didn't care whether he understood them or not. He pulled out his cell phone and scrolled through the contacts list. His son Joey lived in Phoenix, working construction and raising 2 kids with a woman Gino had met exactly once. They talked on birthdays and Christmas, conversations that felt more like obligation than connection. Joey would offer to help if he knew what was happening. Would probably wire money he couldn't afford to spare and feel guilty that it wouldn't be enough. Would suggest that his father sell the house and move to Arizona, where senior living was cheaper and the weather was better for old bones. All of which would be reasonable advice from a loving son who didn't understand that some things couldn't be replaced. And that starting over at 72 felt less like a new beginning than like a confession of failure. Gino put the phone away without dialing. Outside, the temperature was dropping toward freezing. Without heat, the house would be uninhabitable within a few days. The pipes would freeze, the walls would crack. And Sterling would have another code violation to add to his list of reasons why the property needed to be demolished. But as Gino sat in the dark, something else occurred to him. Something about the timing of the power cutoff and the visit from Keystone Asset Recovery. The electric bill wasn't due for another 2 weeks. He'd checked that morning, along with all the other bills he could no longer afford to pay. The power company didn't usually cut service without multiple warnings, and they certainly didn't do it after business hours on a Tuesday. Unless someone had called them. Someone with enough influence to expedite a disconnection and enough motivation to want Gino out of his house as quickly as possible. Gino walked to the junk drawer and pulled out the business card David Sterling had dropped during their conversation. The one with the handwritten note about blighted properties scheduled for demo. In the flashlight beam, the words looked different than they had that morning. Not like a prediction, but like a plan. Sterling hadn't just bought his debt. He'd engineered his downfall, using the reverse mortgage and the forged property inspection as tools to dismantle a life that had taken 43 years to build. The question was why? Why target one elderly carpenter in a neighborhood that wasn't particularly valuable or strategically important? Why go to so much trouble to destroy something that would have crumbled on its own eventually? Gino thought about the Sterling Development website and the photos of all those gleaming new buildings rising from the ashes of demolished communities. Then he thought about location and proximity and the way property values worked when you controlled enough of them. His house sat on a double lot, one of the largest in the neighborhood. The kind of space that could accommodate a small apartment building or a row of townhouses. If you didn't have to worry about an old man who remembered when the area was filled with families instead of investment opportunities. Sterling wasn't just stealing his house. He was clearing the ground for something bigger. Gino walked to the basement and found his survey maps from 1980, when he'd first bought the property. By flashlight, he traced the property lines and calculated square footage. And tried to imagine what his little corner of Pittsburgh might look like to someone who saw land as raw material instead of home. When he came back upstairs, he was carrying his tool belt and a sense of purpose that felt like anger refined into something useful. If Sterling wanted a fight, he'd found one. But first, Gino needed to understand exactly what he was fighting for, and what weapons he had available. The house around him creaked and settled as the temperature dropped, speaking in the voice of old wood and honest construction. It sounded like a conversation between friends, even in the dark. Tomorrow, he would start building his defense. Tonight, he would sit with his house and listen to what it had to tell him. Memory arrived without invitation, the way it always did when Gino least expected it. One moment he was staring at the foreclosure papers by candlelight, and the next he was 35 years old again, standing on steel beams 8 stories above downtown Pittsburgh. Arguing with an architect who thought he knew more about foundations than the man who would have to build them. The building was Sterling's now. The Community Investment Tower, they called it. 30 floors of glass and steel that housed the offices where David Sterling made his living by dismantling other people's lives. But in 1985, it had been just another job. Another set of blueprints that needed to be translated from paper into reality by men who understood that gravity was unforgiving. And that cutting corners on foundation work was a form of slow-motion murder. The drainage system doesn't account for the water table, Gino had told the architect, pointing to the plans with a stubby pencil worn down from constant use. You put the foundation here, and every heavy rain is going to back up into the basement. The architect, fresh from school and full of theories about modern construction, had dismissed Gino's concerns with the kind of smile that cost extra. Mr. Rossi, I appreciate your input, but we've run computer models on this design. The building will be fine. Water always finds a way, Gino had replied. You can model it all you want, but water doesn't care about your computer. They'd built it according to the plans. And every winter for the past 20 years, the basement had flooded. Gino knew this because he'd driven by the building every few months, checking to see if the stress cracks he'd predicted were developing in the foundation walls. They were hairline fractures that would widen over time, creating structural problems that would eventually cost more to fix than the building was worth. Water always found a way. The memory faded, leaving Gino sitting in his cold kitchen with a new understanding of the war he was fighting. Sterling lived and worked in a building with a flawed foundation, making decisions about other people's property while ignoring the problems in his own. That had to mean something. It had to be useful somehow. The library opened at 9 a.m. Gino was waiting outside at 8:30, his breath visible in the morning air, looking like any other senior citizen who needed a warm place to spend the day. The librarian, a kind woman named Sarah who'd helped him research Martha's genealogy project a few years back, let him in early and pointed him toward the computer terminals. Coffee's fresh, she said. And don't worry about the time limit today. You look like you could use some peace and quiet. Gino had never been good with computers, but desperation was a powerful teacher. He typed Sterling Development Flooding Basement into the search engine and waited to see what the internet knew about his enemy's problems. The first result was a news article from 6 months ago. Downtown building tenants sue over water damage. The story described ongoing problems with flooding in the Community Investment Tower, and the building management's refusal to address what they claimed were minor moisture issues. The second result was a complaint filed with the city's building inspection department. 8 different businesses reporting water damage to office equipment, ruined inventory, and health concerns related to mold growth in the basement levels. The third result made Gino smile for the first time in weeks. A class action lawsuit filed by the building's tenants, seeking damages for negligent maintenance and demanding that Sterling Development bring the building up to current safety codes. The legal filing included engineering reports that confirmed what Gino had known 35 years ago: the foundation drainage was inadequate. And the problem would only get worse with time. But the most interesting detail was buried in the third paragraph of the complaint. Sterling Development had recently applied for a permit to demolish and rebuild the Community Investment Tower, claiming that ongoing maintenance costs made renovation financially impractical. The permit application was scheduled for review by the City Planning Committee in 2 weeks. Gino printed the articles and walked to a quiet corner of the library, where he spread the papers across a table and began to piece together the shape of Sterling's larger plan. Sterling needed the Community Investment Tower demolished because fixing the foundation would cost more than the building was worth. But demolishing a 30-story office building in downtown Pittsburgh wasn't something you could do quietly or quickly. You needed environmental clearances, tenant relocations, and most importantly, you needed somewhere else to put all those displaced businesses while you rebuilt. Somewhere like a newly gentrified residential neighborhood, where you could build temporary office complexes and charge premium rents while the main project was under construction. Somewhere like Gino's neighborhood, where property values were low and elderly residents could be pressured to sell quickly. Sterling wasn't just stealing houses. He was clearing land for a temporary business district that would generate revenue while his main building was being rebuilt. Once the new community investment tower was complete, he'd demolish the temporary buildings and develop the residential land for high-end housing. It was a brilliant plan. Ruthless, but brilliant. And it explained why Sterling had been so confident about the foreclosure timeline. He needed Gino's property vacant and available by spring, when the demolition of the downtown building would begin. Gino walked to the reference desk and asked Sarah if he could use the phone. "Of course, honey. Is everything all right? I'm about to find out." He dialed the number for the city planning office and asked to speak with someone about the Sterling development permit application. The clerk who answered sounded tired and overworked. "Sir, that's a complex commercial development proposal. If you want to file a public comment, you'll need to submit it in writing at least 5 days before the hearing." "When is the hearing?" "November 15th, 2 weeks from Friday." "What kind of public comments are you looking for?" "Environmental concerns, traffic impact, that sort of thing." "But sir, I should warn you that these are usually just formalities. If the developer has met all the legal requirements, the committee rarely rejects a permit application." Gino thanked the clerk and hung up the phone. 2 weeks to build a case against a man who had lawyers and engineers and probably half the city council on his payroll. But Gino had something Sterling didn't have. He had knowledge of the building's structural problems that went back 35 years. He had documentation of ongoing maintenance failures that Sterling was trying to hide. And most importantly, he had the blueprints. Not copies, not digital files. The original blueprints from 1985, signed by the architect and the chief engineer. And marked with all the changes and corrections that had been made during construction. Including Gino's handwritten notes about the foundation problems. He'd kept them because he'd always kept everything related to his work. Job records, change orders, inspection reports. Martha used to complain that the garage was full of paper documenting projects that had been finished decades ago. But now those papers might be the only thing standing between Sterling and the complete destruction of everything Gino had spent his life building. He caught the bus home and spent the afternoon digging through boxes in the garage, looking for the folder marked Community Investment Tower 1985. When he found it, his hands were shaking with something that felt like hope mixed with excitement. The blueprints were exactly as he remembered them. And there, in the margin of sheet A7, written in his own careful handwriting, foundation drainage inadequate. Recommend additional French drains and waterproofing. See change order number 47. Change order number 47, which had been rejected by the architect to save money. Change order number 47, which would have prevented 35 years of water damage and tenant lawsuits and the eventual need to demolish a perfectly good building. Change order number 47, which proved that Sterling had known about the building's problems from the very beginning and had chosen to ignore them. Gino smiled and rolled up the blueprints carefully. For the first time since this whole nightmare started, he felt like he had a weapon that might actually hurt his enemy. But first, he needed to find out if he was brave enough to use it. Naomi arrived at dawn with coffee and a determination that reminded Gino of Martha when she'd set her mind to something that couldn't be talked out of. She parked her catering van in his driveway. And knocked on his door with the persistence of someone who'd learned that opportunity didn't wait for convenient timing. "I brought breakfast," she said, holding up a bag that smelled like fresh donuts and possibility. "And I have an idea." Gino let her in, grateful for the company and the warmth of human contact in a house that had grown too quiet since the power went out. They sat in his kitchen while she outlined her plan, which was either brilliant or completely insane. "You said Sterling is trying to demolish that downtown building because of flooding problems?" "That's right. And you have blueprints that show he knew about those problems 35 years ago?" "I have the original blueprints. And the change orders he rejected to save money." Naomi pulled out her phone and showed him a video she'd recorded the night before. Shaky footage of the community investment tower's basement loading dock, where water was seeping through cracks in the foundation walls and pooling on the concrete floor. "I deliver lunch to 3 different offices in that building twice a week. Everyone knows about the water problems. The building management keeps promising to fix it, but they just put out more buckets every time it rains." She swiped to another video, this one showing a utility room where black mold covered the walls like a diseased shadow. "The health department has been called 6 times in the past year." But Sterling has enough political connections to keep delaying the formal inspection. Gino studied the images on her phone screen. The water damage was worse than he'd expected, but not worse than he'd predicted. Foundation problems always got worse with time. What are you thinking? I'm thinking we document everything. Every crack, every puddle, every moldy wall. We build a case that shows the building is uninhabitable and has been for years. Then we present it to the city planning committee when they consider the demolition permit. That won't stop him from getting the permit. It might even help his case. Maybe, but it will also create a public record that he's been operating a dangerous building while collecting rent from tenants. That's criminal negligence. And if we can prove he knew about the problems from the beginning. Gino understood what she was suggesting. It wasn't about stopping the demolition. It was about exposing Sterling's pattern of behavior. Proving that he was the kind of developer who cut corners and ignored safety issues and put profits ahead of people's lives. The kind of developer who might forge inspection reports to accelerate foreclosures. You could get in trouble, Gino said. Breaking into a building, recording without permission. Sterling has lawyers who could make your life very difficult. Mr. Rossi, with respect, my life is already difficult. I work 60 hours a week and still can't afford health insurance. I live in a studio apartment with a daughter who sleeps on the couch because I can't afford a 2-bedroom. Men like Sterling are the reason people like me can't get ahead. She looked at him with the kind of fierce determination that reminded him why he'd thrown away his mortgage payment to help a stranger. Besides, she added, I'm not breaking in. I have legitimate business in that building. And if I happen to notice safety violations while I'm delivering lunch, that's just being a responsible citizen. Gino thought about the tool belt hanging in his basement. And the blueprints spread across his kitchen table and the foreclosure notice that gave him 57 days to find a miracle. When do we start? They spent the morning planning their approach. Naomi would handle the photography and documentation, using her catering deliveries as cover to access different areas of the building. Gino would provide technical expertise, explaining what they were looking at and why it mattered from a construction standpoint. Their first target was the basement loading dock, where Naomi made regular deliveries to a law firm that specialized in personal injury cases. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. Gino dressed in his cleanest work clothes and carried a clipboard that made him look official enough to belong. Anywhere construction-related business was being conducted. They took Naomi's van, which had enough food service equipment in the back to justify their presence if anyone asked questions. The community investment tower rose above them like a monument to architectural arrogance. 30 floors of glass and steel that looked impressive from a distance but showed its age when you got close enough to see the water. Stains and crack repairs and the subtle sagging of a foundation that had been fighting losing battle against Pittsburgh soil for 3 decades. Naomi parked in the delivery area and began unloading catering supplies while Gino walked the perimeter of the loading dock. What he found was worse than her videos had suggested. The foundation walls showed multiple generations of crack repair, each one painted over but still visible if you knew what to look for. Water damage extended higher than what could be explained by normal drainage issues. This wasn't seasonal flooding from heavy rains. This was continuous seepage from a water table that had been disrupted by 35 years of inadequate drainage. Over here, Naomi called softly. She was standing beside a utility door that had been left propped open by building maintenance staff. Beyond the door, a hallway led deeper into the building's basement level. The smell of mold and stagnant water drifted out like a warning. Gino followed her inside, his eyes adjusting to the dim fluorescent lighting that flickered with the irregularity of an electrical system under stress. The hallway was lined with storage rooms and mechanical spaces, most of them showing signs of water damage. But it was the main electrical room that made Gino stop and stare. The main circuit panel was mounted on a wall where water stains extended from the floor to within inches of the electrical connections. Temporary dehumidifiers hummed in corners where they fought a losing battle against moisture that seemed to seep from the concrete itself. "This is insane," Naomi whispered, recording everything with her phone. "How is this building still occupied?" Gino pointed to a series of pipes that ran along the ceiling, dripping steadily into buckets placed at regular intervals. "See those pipes? They're supposed to carry drainage away from the foundation. But they're pitched wrong. The water is flowing back toward the building instead of away from it. He pulled out his phone and took pictures of the pipe installation, comparing what he saw to his memory of the original blueprints. This isn't accidental. Someone modified the drainage system, probably to save money during construction. They worked quickly, documenting everything they could find. Water damage in storage areas, mold growth in ventilation systems, electrical hazards that violated every safety code Gino had learned in 50 years of construction work. But the most damaging evidence was in a mechanical room where building plans were stored in fireproof cabinets. Naomi used her phone to photograph maintenance records that showed repeated complaints about water infiltration, requests for drainage repairs that had been denied due to cost, and inspection reports that had been filed with the city but apparently ignored. Mr. Sterling personally signed off on deferring the drainage repairs, Naomi said, showing Gino a document dated 6 months ago. He called them non-essential maintenance items. Gino studied the signature and compared it to the business card he'd kept in his shirt pocket. Same handwriting, same casual disregard for other people's safety. They were preparing to leave when they heard footsteps in the hallway. Heavy boots and voices that carried the authority of people who belonged in places where others might not. Gino grabbed Naomi's arm and pulled her into an alcove behind the main water heater. They pressed themselves against the wall and waited. While 2 security guards walked past, their flashlight beams sweeping across the walls like searchlights hunting for trespassers. Building management wants a full sweep of all basement areas, one of them was saying. Sterling thinks someone might be documenting the water problems. What's he worried about? Everyone knows this place leaks like a sieve. Yeah, but now it's political. City Planning Committee is reviewing the demolition permit next week. Sterling doesn't want any surprises. The footsteps faded as the guards moved deeper into the building's mechanical areas. Gino and Naomi waited 5 minutes before making their way back to the loading dock. Moving as quietly as 2 people who just learned that their mission was more dangerous than they'd realized. They drove back to Gino's house in silence, both of them processing what they'd discovered. It wasn't until they were sitting in his kitchen, reviewing the photos and videos on Naomi's phone, that the full scope of Sterling's deception became clear. He's not demolishing the building because the foundation is failing, Naomi said. He's demolishing it because fixing the problems would cost more than he wants to spend. And he's been collecting rent from tenants while knowingly operating a building that violates health and safety codes. Gino thought about his own foreclosure papers and the forged property inspection that claimed his house was uninhabitable. Sterling was using the same tactics on a larger scale, declaring properties worthless when it served his financial interests while ignoring real safety problems when addressing them would cost money. We have enough evidence to file a complaint with the city, Naomi said. Maybe enough to delay the demolition permit. Filing a complaint won't stop him. It'll just make him more careful about covering his tracks. Gino stood up and walked to the kitchen window, looking out at the backyard. Where Martha's oak tree stood strong and straight, its roots deep enough to weather any storm. But it might be enough to save my house. He turned back to Naomi with the beginning of a plan that felt like hope mixed with desperation. Sterling's whole scheme depends on timing. He needs my neighborhood cleared for development by spring, when the downtown building comes down. If we can delay the demolition permit, we might be able to delay my foreclosure. How? By proving that Sterling's entire business model is based on fraud and negligence. By showing the City Planning Committee that giving him permission to demolish one building while he's already operating another one illegally isn't in the public interest. Gino picked up the original blueprints from 1985 and spread them across the kitchen table next to Naomi's phone full of current photographs. 35 years of evidence, he said. From foundation to foreclosure. Time to see if the truth is still worth anything in this city. The city council chambers hadn't changed much since Gino had attended PTA meetings there 30 years ago. When Joey was in elementary school and parents still believed their voices mattered in decisions about their children's education. Same fluorescent lighting that made everyone look tired. Same wooden benches that were designed to discourage long speeches. Same portrait of the city's founding fathers, all of them dead white men who'd probably never worried about foreclosure. But tonight felt different. Tonight, the room hummed with the tension of democracy under pressure. Gino arrived early and took a seat in the back row, his folder of blueprints and documentation balanced on his knees like a prayer book. He wore his good shirt, the one Martha had bought him for Joey's high school graduation, and his work boots. Because some battles required both respectability and the reminder that you weren't afraid to get your hands dirty. Naomi sat beside him, her phone charged and ready to record everything. They'd spent the past week organizing their evidence into a presentation that could be delivered in the 3 minutes public comment period allowed. 3 minutes to explain 35 years of fraud and negligence. 3 minutes to save a neighborhood from a man who treated human lives like line items on a balance sheet. The council chamber filled slowly. Sterling's people arrived in expensive suits and confident clusters, carrying briefcases that probably contained enough legal paperwork to wallpaper the room. They took seats near the front, close enough to the council members to suggest familiarity born of campaign contributions and cocktail parties. David Sterling himself walked in at exactly 7 o'clock, dressed like he was attending a board meeting rather than a public hearing. He nodded to several council members and shook hands with the city attorney. The casual gestures of a man who'd already won the battle before the first shot was fired. But Sterling's confidence wavered when he saw Gino sitting in the back row. Their eyes met across the room, and for a moment, Sterling's polished facade cracked enough to reveal something that might have been concern. Or maybe just annoyance that a problem he'd thought he'd solved was still sitting in his courtroom. The meeting began with routine business. Budget approvals and committee reports and the mundane machinery of local government. Grinding through agenda items that would affect thousands of lives in ways the people living those lives would never fully understand. Gino listened to the proceedings with half his attention while studying the council members who would decide Sterling's fate. 5 elected officials who balanced political ambition against public responsibility in calculations that changed, depending on who was watching and who was writing checks. Council Chair Rebecca Martinez called the Sterling development permit application at 8:15, after most of the casual observers had gotten bored and gone home. Strategic timing that ensured the most controversial item on the agenda would be discussed when the fewest voters were paying attention. Sterling's attorney stood first, a thin man with silver hair and the kind of voice that made legal arguments sound like natural law. He presented the demolition permit request as a matter of practical necessity. Supported by engineering reports that documented the building's structural problems and economic analysis that proved renovation was financially unfeasible. The community investment tower has served this city well for 35 years, the attorney said. But age and obsolescence have made replacement the only viable option. My client is prepared to invest $50 million in a state-of-the-art facility that will bring jobs and tax revenue to downtown Pittsburgh. He spoke for 10 minutes, using charts and graphs and architectural renderings to paint a picture of progress that would benefit everyone. No mention of the tenant lawsuits or the health department complaints. Or the fact that Sterling had been collecting rent on a building he claimed was uninhabitable. When the attorney finished, Council Chair Martinez asked if anyone wished to speak in opposition. Gino stood up. Mr. Rossi, Martinez said, consulting her notes. You have 3 minutes. Gino walked to the podium carrying his folder of evidence and 35 years of experience in separating truth from wishful thinking. He looked out at the council members and the audience and Sterling's team of lawyers. All of them waiting to see what an old carpenter might have to say about urban development policy. My name is Gino Rossi, he began. I built that building. The room got quieter. I was the construction foreman on the Community Investment Tower project in 1985. I've been watching it leak for 35 years. He opened his folder and pulled out the original blueprints, spreading them across the podium where the council members could see them. These are the original construction plans. You can see my handwriting in the margins, documenting drainage problems that the architect refused to address. Change Order Number 47, dated August 15, 1985. Additional waterproofing and French drains. Rejected due to cost. Gino looked directly at Sterling, who was staring back with the expression of a man watching his carefully constructed world begin to collapse. Mr. Sterling knew about those problems from day one. He chose to ignore them then, and he's been ignoring them ever since. While collecting rent from tenants who work in flooded basements and breathe moldy air. Naomi stood up and walked to the front of the room, her phone connected to a portable projector they'd borrowed from the library. The photos and videos she'd recorded began playing on the wall behind the council members. Water pooling in electrical rooms. Mold covering walls. Buckets placed under leaking pipes. Maintenance records showing repeated requests for repairs that were denied as non-essential. This isn't structural obsolescence, Gino continued. This is criminal negligence. And now Mr. Sterling wants permission to tear down the evidence and build something new on land he's stealing from senior citizens who can't afford to fight him in court. Sterling's attorney was on his feet, objecting to the use of recordings made without permission, but Council Chair Martinez waved him quiet. Let him finish. I'm 72 years old, Gino said. I've built half the houses in my neighborhood and fixed the other half. I know the difference between maintenance and fraud. Mr. Sterling is using the same forged inspection reports to steal my house that he's using to justify demolishing his building. He pulled out the foreclosure papers and the property maintenance inspection that claimed his house was structurally unsound. According to this report, my house has water damage to the foundation. But I replaced that foundation with steel beams 10 years ago. According to this report, my electrical system is compromised. But it was updated to current code in 2019. This inspection is fiction. The room was completely silent now. Even Sterling's lawyers had stopped rustling through their papers. Mr. Sterling targets elderly homeowners with equity but limited cash flow. He uses reverse mortgages and predatory lending to create situations where people can't meet the payment terms. Then he manufactures building code violations to accelerate foreclosures. Gino looked around the room, making eye contact with each council member in turn. He's not revitalizing neighborhoods, he's destroying them, and he's using the same tactics on his own building that he's using on our homes. Claiming structural problems that could be fixed in order to justify demolition that serves his bottom line. The 3 minutes were almost up. Gino gathered his papers and prepared to return to his seat, but Council Chair Martinez gestured for him to continue. Take your time, Mr. Rossi. The question isn't whether Mr. Sterling has the legal right to demolish his building, Gino said. The question is whether this city should enable a business model based on fraud and elder abuse. Whether we should give public approval to a man who's been operating a dangerous building while suing his tenants for water damage he caused himself. He folded the blueprints carefully and put them back in his folder. I built that building to last 100 years. It's only 35 years old. With proper drainage and foundation repair, it could serve this city for generations. But fixing it wouldn't make Mr. Sterling as much money as tearing it down and starting over. Gino looked at Sterling one last time. The foundation is still sound. It's the owner that's rotten. The council chamber erupted. Sterling's supporters and opponents shouted over each other while the lawyers scrambled to respond to accusations they hadn't prepared for. Council Chair Martinez gavelled for order, but the damage was done. The story was out. The evidence was public record. And David Sterling, for the first time in his adult life, looked like a man who wasn't sure he was going to win. The vote on the demolition permit was delayed pending a full investigation by the Building Inspection Department. Gino's foreclosure was stayed pending a review of the property maintenance inspection that had triggered the accelerated payment demand. And somewhere in the chaos of a democracy that occasionally remembered to work for the people who needed it most, an old carpenter and a young woman who delivered lunch for a living had reminded a room full of powerful people that the truth was still worth something, even when it was inconvenient. 6 months later, Gino woke to the sound of voices in his driveway and the smell of coffee brewing in a kitchen where the lights worked. And the heat came on when you turned the thermostat. Spring had arrived with the kind of gentle persistence that reminded him why Martha had always loved this time of year. When winter finally loosened its grip and the world remembered how to be green again. Through his bedroom window, he could see Naomi setting up her catering van beside the oak tree that had grown tall enough to shade most of the backyard. Her daughter Sophia was helping, or trying to help, her 8-year-old hands more eager than skilled but her enthusiasm worth more than competence. Gino dressed slowly, his joints protesting the morning routine but not as loudly as they had 6 months ago. Having a future again was better medicine than anything the doctor had prescribed. The foreclosure notice was gone, replaced by a letter from the Pennsylvania Attorney General's office, informing him that his property had been included in a class action settlement against Keystone Equity lenders. The forged inspection reports, the accelerated payment demands, the manufactured code violations, all of it documented and prosecuted and settled for enough money to pay off his reverse mortgage. With funds left over for the kind of retirement he'd always planned but never thought he'd see. Sterling was gone too, not just from Gino's neighborhood but from Pittsburgh entirely. Federal charges related to elder abuse and securities fraud had a way of making even well-connected developers disappear from the social scene. The community investment tower was being renovated by a company that specialized in historic preservation. The foundation problems finally being addressed with the drainage systems Gino had recommended 35 years ago. Water always found a way. But so did justice, when enough people cared to help it along. Gino made his way downstairs and found Sophia sitting at his kitchen table, coloring in a notebook while her mother prepared lunch orders in the van outside. The little girl looked up when he entered, her face brightening with the kind of smile that reminded him why he'd always wanted grandchildren. "Morning, Mr. Gino. Mama said to tell you the coffee's ready." "Thank you, sweetheart. What are you working on there?" Sophia held up her notebook, showing him a drawing of a house with flowers in the front yard and people standing in the doorway. "It's your house," she said. "But with Mama and me living here too." Gino studied the picture, noting the careful way she'd drawn the oak tree and the front porch and the details. That meant she'd been paying attention to the place she'd come to think of as home. Naomi had moved in 3 months ago, after her landlord raised the rent on her studio apartment beyond what her catering business could support. It was supposed to be temporary, just until she could save enough money for a place of her own. But temporary had a way of becoming permanent when it felt right, and having people in the house again felt more right than Gino had expected. He poured coffee from the pot Naomi had started and walked to the kitchen window, looking out at the neighborhood that had survived David Sterling's vision of progress. Mrs. Chen was in her garden, planting tomatoes with the confidence of someone who expected to harvest them in August. The young couple who'd bought the Henderson place was refinishing their front porch, working together with the kind of shared purpose that reminded him of his early years with Martha. The community was healing, not just from Sterling's predatory schemes, but from the deeper wounds of isolation and despair that came from feeling powerless in the face of forces beyond individual control. Naomi came in from the van, carrying a sandwich wrapped in brown paper. "Prosciutto and fig jam," she said, setting it beside his coffee. "The same kind you bought that first day. I make them special for you now." Gino unwrapped the sandwich and took a bite. It tasted like triumph, which was probably just his imagination but felt real enough to matter. "Good morning to you too. The lawyers called," Naomi said. "Final settlement documents are ready for signature. You want to drive downtown after lunch?" "Sure. Sophia can come with us if she wants. Make an adventure of it." Sophia looked up from her drawing. "Can we get ice cream?" "I think that can be arranged." Naomi sat down across from him, her own coffee cooling while she checked messages on her phone. The catering business was growing, built on word of mouth, recommendations, and the kind of personal service that came from treating customers like neighbors rather than transactions. "I've been thinking about something," she said. "The settlement money. What you're planning to do with it." Gino had been thinking about that too. More money than he'd ever had at one time, enough to live comfortably for the rest of his life without worrying about property taxes or medical bills, or the 1,000 small expenses that ate away at fixed incomes. Some of it goes to Sophia's education fund. Some of it goes to fixing up the house. And some of it goes to making sure what happened to us doesn't happen to other people. "What do you mean?" "Legal clinic. Free advice for seniors dealing with foreclosure or predatory lending. Maybe partner with the library or the community center. Help people understand their rights before they lose everything trying to figure it out alone." Naomi smiled, the kind of smile that said she wasn't surprised but was pleased anyway. Martha would have liked that idea. She would have organized the whole thing, had volunteers scheduled and pamphlets printed and a waiting list of people who needed help. Gino finished his sandwich and walked to the kitchen sink, where he could see his reflection in the window glass. The face looking back was older than the one that had started this journey 6 months ago, but it was also steadier. The hands that held his coffee cup didn't shake anymore. The eyes that met his own gaze held something that looked like peace. Outside, a delivery truck was backing into Mrs. Chen's driveway. New appliances, probably. She'd been talking about replacing her refrigerator since before Martha died, but had never been able to afford it until the class action settlement came through. Everyone in the neighborhood had been affected by Sterling's schemes in one way or another. Illegal fee assessments, property tax manipulation, bogus lien filings, the kind of systematic fraud that destroyed communities one house at a time while generating profits measured in millions of dollars. But communities could heal too, when people remembered that their individual problems were often part of larger patterns. And that fighting back together was more effective than suffering alone. Gino's phone rang. The display showed a number he didn't recognize, but he answered anyway. Mr. Rossi? This is Jennifer Chen from Channel 4 News. We're doing a follow-up story on the Sterling development case, and we'd like to interview you about how the settlement has affected your neighborhood. Gino looked out the window at Mrs. Chen unloading her new refrigerator and Sophia drawing pictures of home and Naomi building a business that fed people while treating them with dignity. Sure, he said, but you'll want to talk to my neighbors too. This was never just about one old man's house. After he hung up, he sat back down at the kitchen table and picked up Sophia's notebook. She was working on a new drawing now, this one showing the oak tree in full summer bloom, its branches reaching wide enough to shelter the entire backyard. That's going to be beautiful when you finish it, he said. It's for you, Sophia replied. For your bedroom, so you can remember that some things last even when other things change. Gino studied the drawing and thought about Martha and the house they'd built together and the way love could survive. Even when the people who created it couldn't. He thought about foundations and drainage and the importance of building things that would last long enough to matter. The oak tree in Sophia's drawing looked strong enough to weather any storm. Its roots ran deep, anchored in soil that had been tended by people who understood that growth took time and care. And the kind of patience that measured success in decades rather than quarterly profits. That afternoon, Gino signed the final settlement papers in a downtown law office where he was treated like a client rather than a problem. The lawyers shook his hand and congratulated him on his victory, but he knew the truth was more complicated than that. Victory wasn't getting his house back. Victory was learning that fighting for what mattered was always worth the effort, even when you weren't sure you could win. Walking back to the parking garage, he stopped in front of the community investment tower, where construction crews were installing the French drains he'd recommended 35 years ago. The building would be beautiful when they finished, a monument to the idea that fixing problems was usually more rewarding than abandoning them. A young construction worker looked up from his work and nodded at Gino's worn tool belt. You in the trade? Was. Retired now. This is good work. Whoever designed the original drainage system knew what he was doing. We're just updating it to current standards. Gino smiled and continued toward his truck, where Naomi and Sophia were waiting with ice cream and stories about their afternoon adventure. On the drive home, Sophia fell asleep in the back seat, her notebook clutched against her chest. Naomi pointed out improvements in their neighborhood. Fresh paint on the Morrison house. New windows on the duplex where the Rodriguez family lived. Signs of a community that had rediscovered its confidence. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't helped me that day? Naomi asked. Gino thought about it. The question of alternate histories and different choices and the way small acts of courage could ripple outward in ways you never expected. I think you would have figured out another way to fight back, he said. Some people are built for giving up. Others are built for getting back up. What about you? I'm built for building things. Always have been. That evening, after dinner and dishes and the comfortable routine of a house where people took care of each other, Gino sat on his front porch and watched the sun set behind the oak tree that had grown tall enough to shade the entire backyard. The foreclosure notice was gone. The power was on. The foundation was solid, but more important than any of that, the house was full of voices again. Laughter and conversation and the sound of Sophia practicing piano on the old upright that had belonged to Martha's grandmother. Life doesn't end just because it breaks once. What falls apart can be the very place where we learn to stand again. If this story gave even a small moment of strength to someone out there, then everything I went through means something today. If this resonated with you, please like and subscribe, and share a piece of your own story in the comments below. Your words might become the seed of the next chapter we create together. Thank you for spending